The house was suffocating. Every time I walked through the front door, the walls seemed to close in on me, pressing down with a heavy weight I couldn't shake off. I had lived in this house for years, but somehow it never felt like my home. It belonged to someone else now. It belonged to her. She was always there, a constant, lingering presence in the corners of the rooms. In the space between my father and me, I could feel her everywhere. In the smell of her perfume on the pillows, in the way she set the table just so. In the way she and my father had begun to speak in a language I couldn't understand, one that didn't have room for me anymore. And it wasn't just the house that had changed. It was me. I had become a stranger in my own life, watching from the sidelines as everything I had once known slipped further and further away. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't the one who had changed. They had changed, and I was the one left behind. That night the tension in the house was unbearable. My father had been quiet all evening, lost in his own world, and she had barely said a word. But I could feel her eyes on me, even when she wasn't looking. I had to do something. I couldn't keep pretending that I was okay with this. That I could live in a house that no longer had room for me. I found her in the living room, sitting by the fire. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, but when she heard me approach, she turned and looked at me with that same, ever-calm gaze. The one that made everything feel like my fault. "You wanted to talk?" Her voice was soft, almost too soft. But I could hear the challenge behind the words. She had always been good at pretending that nothing bothered her, that everything was fine. But I knew better. I had always known better. "I don't know what you want from me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though it felt like a scream in my chest. "I don't know why you're here, why you've come into our lives and changed everything. Why can't you just leave?" She didn't flinch. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. "You're wrong," she said calmly. "I didn't come into your life to change it. I came into your father's life to give him something he'd been missing. Something he needed." I felt my heart skip a beat. Needed? The words tasted bitter, but I couldn't stop myself from speaking. "You've replaced me," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "You've taken everything from me. The family, the house, the way things were before. And now you're trying to push me out. You're trying to make me feel like I don't belong here anymore." Her eyes softened, just a little, but there was no pity in them. Only something colder. "This house can't hold two regrets," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. "You're a regret that neither of us can afford anymore." I froze. The words hit me like a slap. A regret? That's all I was to her? That's all I had ever been? For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The pain, the humiliation, it all crushed me. I had spent so many years trying to hold on to what was mine. Trying to fight for my place in a house that had never really been mine to begin with. But hearing her say those words, I couldn't ignore them anymore. "I'm not your regret," I said, my voice shaking now, not with fear, but with the weight of everything that had built up inside me. "I'm not the one who's been ruining everything. You've been doing that. You've been taking everything from me, from my family. And I'm not going to let you take any more." Her gaze hardened, the calmness in her expression turning into something else, something colder. Something final. "You have no idea what you're saying," she said, standing up. "You don't understand how hard this has been for your father and me. And the sooner you accept it, the sooner we can all move on with our lives." I shook my head, stepping back. "No, I'm done accepting it. I'm done being your replacement, your regret. I'm done pretending that this house is mine when it's clear that it never was. She didn't say anything else. She just turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor as she retreated back into the shadows of her perfect life. And for the first time, I let myself feel what I had been hiding for so long. I wasn't just angry. I was heartbroken. I was furious. And for the first time, I realized that I had been holding on to the wrong things. I wasn't the one who needed to change. She was. And it was time for me to let go of everything that had been taken from me. It was time for me to walk away. The first few days away from the house were strange, disorienting. I kept expecting to hear the familiar sounds of the house, the creaking of the floorboards, the distant hum of her voice, the soft murmur of my father's presence in the background. But all of it had faded. The house, with its walls that had once confined me, was nothing but a distant memory. The world outside felt too big, too open, and for the first time, I realized how much I had let myself be trapped by everything that had been happening. I rented a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a simple one-bedroom in a building that smelled faintly of old wood and dust. It was a far cry from the sprawling house I had once called home. But there was something comforting about the simplicity of it. There were no expectations here, no oppressive shadows hanging over me. Just four walls, a roof over my head, and the quiet. The first night in the apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the words she had said to me. This house can't hold two regrets. I was a regret. The truth hit harder now that I was away. I had spent so long trying to hold on to something that never truly belonged to me. Trying to be part of a family that had moved on without me. But in that moment, away from the chaos, I finally understood. She wasn't my problem. The truth was, I had allowed myself to be made invisible, to shrink into a shadow of who I was. I had let her words and her presence take up more space than they ever should have. I couldn't do that anymore. But the anger still simmered beneath the surface. The part of me that wanted to confront her, to shout at her, to make her understand the damage she had caused. I wanted to demand answers from my father. Ask him how he could stand by while she tore everything apart. But I knew now that nothing would change. The truth was too late for them. It had already been buried in lies, too deep for anyone to dig it up. I didn't need to force it anymore. I didn't need to fix what was broken. The next day, I made the decision to let it go. I stopped checking the house. I stopped asking about what was happening there. I let them keep their world, and I started creating my own. It wasn't easy at first. The isolation was both freeing and terrifying, but the more I allowed myself to be, the more I started to feel like myself again. I began to rebuild my life in a way that wasn't centered around them, around their expectations. But the question lingered in the back of my mind. What would happen if I went back? What if I confronted her, told her everything that had been building inside me, every hurt, every betrayal? But as the days passed, the desire to confront them faded. I realized it didn't matter. I didn't need closure from them. I didn't need permission to feel like I was worthy of a space of my own. I was already enough. I started to meet people who didn't know me as his daughter or as her stepdaughter. People who only saw me, and it was freeing. I went to art classes, made friends at the local coffee shop. And for the first time in so long, I didn't feel like I was hiding. But one afternoon, I was walking down the street when I saw a familiar face. My father. He was standing outside a store, his hands in his pockets, looking older than I remembered. There was a time when I thought I could never face him again. Not after everything that had happened. But here he was, just as I had left him, with her by his side. She stood a few feet behind him, her gaze focused on the ground. I could feel the distance between us. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that had been building for years. He didn't see me at first, but when he did, his face softened. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed by an awkward pause. He took a step toward me, but I didn't move. "You're doing okay, right?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. It was the same question he'd asked 100 times before, but this time, it felt like he was trying to make up for something. Something that could never be fixed. I looked at him, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. But then, I realized that I didn't need to say anything. I had spent too long trying to explain myself, trying to make him understand. "I'm fine," I said simply. "Better than fine, actually. I'm starting over. I don't need you to fix anything for me." He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again. It wasn't the apology I had expected, but it was enough. The silence between us wasn't filled with resentment. It was just there, a space that was neither filled with anger nor with forgiveness. Just with a quiet understanding that things had changed. And they couldn't go back to what they once were. "I hope you're happy," he said, his voice quieter now. Like he wasn't sure if the words were meant for me or for himself. "I am," I replied, looking at him for the first time in years, seeing him not as my father, but as a man who had made his own choices, just as I had made mine. I turned and walked away then, not looking back. It wasn't a rejection, nor was it a dramatic exit. It was just the end of something, and the beginning of something new. The house couldn't hold two regrets. And I wasn't going to be one of them anymore. The days that followed were filled with silence. The house felt like a tomb, every corner too quiet, every room too still. My father had barely spoken to me, and when he did, it was just to offer empty assurances that everything would be fine. But I didn't believe him anymore. She was still there, lurking in the background, weaving her way into every conversation. Every moment, it was as if nothing had changed. As if I hadn't just walked away from the life I had known. From the family that was never really mine. But I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending. I packed my things in the dead of night, careful not to make a sound. I didn't want to hear her footsteps coming down the hall. Didn't want to hear my father's voice calling out, asking what was going on. I just needed to leave. To escape the weight of the lies. By morning, I was gone. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. There was no more room for that in my life. All I knew was that I had to start over. I had to find a place where I could be myself again. A place where no one could tell me that I was a regret. A place where I could finally breathe without the weight of her presence following me. Everywhere. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, freedom. The house couldn't hold two regrets. But I wasn't one of them anymore. It wasn't long after that encounter with my father that I started to realize how far I had come. The strange weight of being constantly in the shadow of that house, of those people, of her, had started to lift. Each day that I spent outside the confines of my old life felt like another step toward a version of myself I had long forgotten. I hadn't gone back to the house since that day, and honestly, I didn't miss it. I didn't miss her, the way she had carved herself into the walls. The way she had made it clear that she was the one who belonged. I didn't miss the feeling of being constantly pushed aside. Of being made to feel like I was a burden in my own life. I didn't miss any of it. Instead, I started to find comfort in new things. In new faces, new places, new routines that didn't revolve around the drama of my past. I made myself a home in the small apartment that had once felt too lonely, too quiet. Now, it was mine, and it was all I needed. There were no shadows here, no whispers from behind closed doors. Just me, just space. One evening, I sat by the window in the small cafe I had come to frequent. The warmth from the mug of tea in my hands spread through me, calming my nerves in ways I hadn't expected. I'd been avoiding a lot of things, but the one thing I hadn't been able to avoid was the question that had been nagging at me. What if I went back? What if I showed up at the door, walked into that house, and confronted her once and for all? What would I say? How would I feel? Would I even recognize the person I'd become? I wasn't sure, and maybe, at that moment, I didn't need to know. I hadn't heard from my father since our brief conversation on the street, and part of me wondered if that had been his way of finally letting go. If he was trying to give me the space I needed to heal. Or maybe he was just as unsure as I was. We had always had a fragile relationship, one that had been strained by so many things. I had always wanted to be seen by him, wanted him to be the father I needed him to be. But maybe that wasn't who he was. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for him to be something he couldn't be. It wasn't just about him. It was about me. I couldn't keep living in the past. And I wasn't going to keep running from the life I had left behind. It had been tempting to stay away forever, to cut all ties and forget about it. But that wouldn't heal me. I needed to face it. I needed to face her. But how? The question lingered, and for the first time, I didn't have an immediate answer. A few weeks later, I found myself standing outside the house once again. The decision to come back wasn't made on impulse. I had thought about it long and hard. It was dusk, and the house was bathed in soft, golden light, but it felt strangely empty. The air around me was thick with memories, but I wasn't here to relive them. I wasn't here to rehash what had happened. I wasn't even here to argue or to seek some form of closure. I was here because I needed to reclaim something that had always been mine, the right to move forward without being haunted by what had been taken from me. I rang the doorbell, the sound echoing through the still air. I waited for what felt like an eternity before the door opened. And there she was, standing in front of me, just as poised, just as calm. But now there was something else. A vulnerability, perhaps, or maybe just the realization that I wasn't the same person who had left. I couldn't tell if it was relief or something darker in her eyes. But she didn't speak at first. She just stared at me, as if she were waiting for me to say something. "I don't want anything from you," I said, my voice steady. But I felt the remnants of old wounds rising to the surface. "I don't need anything from you. But I do need to understand. I need to know why you made me feel like I didn't belong. Why you made me feel like I was nothing." Her expression faltered for just a moment. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, but there was something in her face that wasn't there before. A crack in the armor. "I never meant to hurt you," she said quietly. "I never wanted you to feel like you didn't belong here." It wasn't the apology I had expected, but it was enough to make me pause. The words didn't fix everything, but they gave me something I hadn't had before. A moment of honesty. "You don't need to apologize," I said, shaking my head. "I don't need you to fix anything. I'm done waiting for you to fix what's broken. I'm just done. I'm done with trying to make this house, or you, or anything feel like home again." She didn't speak, but she nodded, almost imperceptibly. The air between us was heavy, but it wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with the quiet understanding that, at least for this moment, we could both move on. I turned to leave, but before I stepped off the porch, I looked back one last time. She was standing there, still watching, still waiting. But I wasn't. I wasn't waiting for anything from her anymore. I had nothing left to prove. And for the first time, I felt like I had finally stepped out from under her shadow. I wasn't anyone's regret, and I didn't need to keep living like I was. I walked away, and this time, I knew I wasn't looking back. Walking away from the house felt like the first deep breath I had taken in years. The weight that had settled on my chest for so long was lifting, piece by piece. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't need to know. The future, with all its uncertainties, no longer seemed as terrifying as it once had. I had taken control of my own path, and for once, it was enough to simply move forward. The days that followed were a blur of small moments, each one leading me to a place of quiet acceptance. The anger that had fueled me for so long, the bitterness, the hurt, they began to fade. I didn't need to constantly replay the past in my head. The more I let go of it, the less it seemed to matter. The house, the people, the memories, they weren't me anymore. I found myself spending more time in the places I had avoided. I wandered through parks, sat at the edges of lakes, and visited quiet spots where I could just be. For the first time in years, I wasn't bound by the expectations of anyone else. I didn't have to live up to anyone else's idea of who I was supposed to be. I was starting to understand that the only person I needed to answer to was myself. A few weeks later, I received a message from my father. I hadn't expected to hear from him again, not after everything that had happened. But the message was simple: I miss you. Can we talk? I didn't reply right away. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave everything behind, to just keep moving forward. But there was another part of me that needed closure. There was a part of me that still cared, despite everything. We met at a small cafe, a neutral space that felt safe for both of us. He was already sitting at a table when I arrived, looking older than I remembered. The lines on his face more pronounced than they had been before. But it wasn't just the physical change I noticed. There was something in his eyes, a weariness, a regret, that hadn't been there before. I sat down across from him, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was so much unsaid, so much hurt between us. But in the silence, I realized that there was also a kind of understanding now. Something I hadn't thought possible. I know I wasn't the father you needed, he said quietly, his voice low, as if every word weighed on him. I wasn't there when I should have been, and I let things happen that I shouldn't have. I stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for the sincerity I had longed for. It wasn't an apology I had imagined, but it was enough. It was the first time I had heard him admit the truth, and for that, I was grateful. I didn't need him to fix it. I didn't need him to apologize for everything. I just needed him to see me, to see what had been taken from me. I'm not angry anymore, I said softly. I've been angry for a long time, but I'm not now. I've realized that holding on to that anger was just keeping me stuck. And I don't want to be stuck anymore. He nodded, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name, relief, maybe, or sadness. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that, but I'm glad you've found a way to move on. We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the past between us, but no longer suffocating. When we finally left, It wasn't with any grand resolution or promise to be different. It was just the quiet understanding that we were both trying, in our own ways, to move forward. As I walked away from the cafe, I didn't feel the need to look back anymore. I had said what needed to be said, and he had said his piece. The past no longer had a hold on me. It had taken a long time, but I had finally learned that I didn't need anyone else's validation to move on. I wasn't her regret. I wasn't anyone's regret. I wasn't bound by their choices anymore. And for the first time, I felt truly free. I walked down the street with my head held a little higher. The weight of the world no longer pressing down on me. Whatever came next, I knew I would face it on my own terms. And that was enough.